Welcome to Epic Inspire podcast, where we talk about different issues in the psychedelic space around ethics as well as beyond that. And today's episode, we're actually going to start looking at a case study. We're going to be integrating from general topics, but also bring up case studies where we can discuss and look at. And so this is one of our first case studies, and it's current. We're calling this, we just decided that this is going to be called the case of the recording facilitator. And let me give you some of the basics of the case. And this is something that was presented to me. Someone shared with me on social media. It was basically a facilitator who recorded themselves while holding space for someone in a 12-gram mushroom journey. So to give you a bit more of the context, they had taken, maybe 3 different videos, and we'll say for the sake of argument, one was right in the beginning, like in preparation or as they were taking a dose, not the facilitator, the person that they were holding space for. And then they also took another time to do another recording in the middle of the person's journey, again, with what's considered to be a high dose 12-gram mushroom, psychedelic mushroom journey, and then did another recording towards the end of their journey, possibly even post journey, commenting again. And in general, it sounded like the purpose or intention was to help educate someone and give people perspective of what happens during a journey and how you hold space and some of the things that they were choosing to do to hold space for that journey, and give some people some good advice. So, and this was shared on social media publicly. And I got to see it. I've only watched it once, in all fairness, and Sam hasn't watched it at all. But we thought this was a good case study to discuss. So this is, at first I actually thought it was a case of recording the client during the journey, which I know has happened. But in this particular case, it was a facilitator just recording themselves, but they're actively supporting a client. So let's look at this case. You can have some initial thoughts yourself, but we've kind of presented some of the basic facts, but we're going to look at this in general in terms of what are some of the ethical issues and concerns that arise around any facilitator doing a recording while they are responsible for holding space for a client. And hopefully have some takeaways for us. So Sam, what are some of your first thoughts? What are some of the flags that come up for you? Green flags, red flags, or otherwise?
Well, look, I don't know about. I have to think about the green flags. Although I want to give people the benefit of the
Well,
doubt,
let's start with some green flags.
green
Green
flags. They have
flags.
a good intentions to educate, intentions to
Yeah,
make
we love education.
practice in the practice in the field better. Also intentions to give to provide something that's maybe a bit more grounded in practice, something that is grounded in real actual practice, rather than just sort of theorizing. This isn't something from someone who has no, this isn't someone talking about it theoretically, who's never actually, held space for someone or never sat in a room with someone who's on a in an altered state or on a journey. So that is like that's good, but
You ready for the bets? Maybe I should say something good first. Okay, so yeah, I agree. Giving education that is based on real experience. And this person said that they've been doing it for like more than a decade, right? And they are doing it in a legal area, not an illegal area. Just to inform, because we're about legal practice here. Um, and so I also appreciate that it was done in a legal setting. It was done with the intention to educate and inform, and possibly to do outreach for their, possibly as also as marketing, which, depending upon your perspective on what is appropriate marketing. Uh, and also, I mean, I could also argue like to help, allay even some fears or hesitations someone might have about what may come up in an experience, especially a high dose experience, right? So
right.
grounded, informed, experienced, legal, uh, uh, with what seemed to be intended to be supportive for everyone, both, and they seem to have a calm, relaxed demeanor during the recording. Okay.
Okay.
Red flags, yellow flags, orange flags. What do we got?
Well, look, I don't know how sort of. I might have to think more carefully about how I categorize sort of red
No, it's
versus
just true. We don't have to
orange,
come up with all the colors, but
but
red flag is just something, an item
yeah,
of concern. Well,
item
what
of
do you
concern.
make it a yellow or orange?
Well, look,
I am concerned about, what don't we know? What don't we know about this case? Maybe that's a good place to start. Like, we
a
have
good
the
place to
facts that we
start
do know, but there's a lot that we
yeah.
don't know.
Now, I would assume that this is that this person has, I think, well, I don't know. You've seen the video and I haven't. I assume that they have consent from the person that they're guiding, that they're sitting for.
Yes.
To record this, I mean, were they still in the presence of literally still in the presence of the person when they were recording this, or did they have to leave to record it? That's the kind of things that I'm sort of wondering about, because obviously, the consent thing is important. Did they have consent? That is important, but it's also, for something like this, for reasons which might be obvious later, I would probably also argue that this isn't the kind of thing maybe that you should even ask a client to agree to. But yeah, my immediate concern would be consent and safety were my immediate.
Devil's advocate on this, right? First, let's just point out, we don't have all the information to know whether or not any of this was consensual by the client. And it's not clear, at least on the initial showing or from what I recall from the one time I watched, whether or not they even disclosed whether or not the client had consented or not consented, or whether they even considered whether the client would consent to them doing a sort of live commentary, even though I believe it was recorded in little segments and then stitched together and then shown post journey experience. I don't know whether or not that video was even shown to the client for consent, or where they were in their journey or anything. There's a lot of facts we don't know around consent and respecting the client need. And in terms of devil's advocate, can we consider a circumstance where this would be okay? I think maybe maybe that could be one ground level. I think our initial response is that this is not okay.
Yeah,
right?
I think so.
Yeah. But because we don't have all the facts, there may be circumstances that may make it more okay. I'll throw in some facts that could be possible. One is that, let's say we find out that the client consented, and they were consented before they recorded, and post recording, and even reviewed the recording and had the right to remove the recording.
Yeah.
Right?
That would be the minimum level of consent that I would be wanting to look for in this. Also, I would really want the relationship between the person who was on the journey and this guide to be relatively equal, because it would be one thing for someone, if the person who was on the journey is someone who's themselves has some power or has experience in the field, or is in the public eye a lot themselves. There's something where it's not someone who's, the counterpoint would be is if the client in this case was someone who is personally or psychologically vulnerable, or doesn't feels for whatever reason that there is a sort of a big power differential between this facilitator and them. Then it's did they feel compelled to say yes? Did they feel like they couldn't say no, or at what point did they give what point did they give consent? Are they still at that stage where they're so are they in the afterglow? Are they worshipping the ground this facilitator walks on because they've just had an amazing experience and experiencing relief from something that they've been working through before? So there's lots of times when consent is really is difficult and has to be treated really carefully. So I think it would be, considering those kind of things, is, consent. You could have validly gotten consent for this, but it has to be approached really carefully.
Yeah, and I'll say like I'll simplify into say it's like two questions that someone who's a facilitator should ask at the bare minimum, like what is the capacity of the person you're asking for consent, and is there anything in the particular circumstance that could be coercive, right? And then there's the sort of basic thing about like informed consent, about information, deliberation, and options. Whereas like, were they properly informed? Were they educated? Did they have time to deliberate and understand what they were considering? And were they given an option not to? Right? Like for example, like, oh, I record all of these things. This is something I do. If you work with me, this is, right? Or did they record first? Or like there's sort of timing issues too that can make it coercive. Or what was it done in, like for instance, if they consented, but maybe they were under financial duress and it creates a coercive situation for the person. There's lots of things that could, it's already a power dynamic between a facilitator and a client in these situations, just off the bat. There can be extra things that can increase that power dynamic or reduce that power, like make it more equitable in terms of the dynamic. But anyway, consent is definitely a concern. Definitely. Like I think it's of the concerns in this one, consent is one of the big ones.
Yep, but we could give them the benefit of the doubt and say that we could, in absence of particularly,
Of
since
evidence.
we don't know either way of evidence either way, like we could, I mean, we could say even if they had consent, there are still things to. That's not where the discussion ends. There are still things to say about it, even if there was consent.
Right. And now here let's say like now then there's also the question of, is there ever a case we could consider that this would be ethically okay? Right? So like let's say we have the penultimate in consent stuff that was gone through, and capacity and knowledge and things like that. Is it ever okay for a facilitator to record and share on social media uh, when they have, because you were asking this question, right? Like, is it even something you should ask a client? Like, is this even something that, just by the idea of talking about it or trying to do it, is this something outside of something that a facilitator should be doing? Right? Like create a contrast case. Like you think about like, the sort of like documentary or live reporting things where they're recording the event. But usually like if it's a journalist or a reporter or something like that, they're not actually the ones doing the activity, right? It's something being observed, more observed, even if they're in the situation. Like think of like the live journalist at a war scene, right? So the journalist, isn't outside of the war zone. They're in the war zone in order to be able to document the experience, right? Or to document what's happening. But it can be hard to create clear lines of, are you involved in what's happening or are you not involved?
Yes.
Right?
Well,
Like
in
when
this
are you
case,
complicit?
they're very clearly involved in what is happening, what they
Yes.
are documenting, because that is the point of it, is they are documenting the thing that they are doing.
Yes.
Yeah. So
And so I think that's important to note. Like if it was, let's say, another facilitator who was talking about what the other facilitator was doing. So they weren't the one facilitating the experience, but they were, again, still having the same aims that we mentioned, like educating, informed from a grounded things. And we've seen lots
yeah,
of documentaries out there in
and
the
all of
psychedelic
this
space.
without all of this without ever showing the client on screen, for
Right. The client
example.
was not shown on the screen
Yep.
from what I saw. I was not hearing the client. I was not seeing the client. And I will say that they also roughly seem to de-identify the client.
Yeah. Yeah.
But it could
As
be
they
that
should.
some of
Yeah.
the facts could, were enough that the client themselves may be able to figure out it was them, right? Which is also worth mentioning. And one way could also, like, let's say they are the facilitator, but they had other facilitators who were supporting the experience. That's something else we don't know in this case, is whether or not there were other supporters of the person or whether it was someone just by themselves supporting it. But
Yeah.
outside of that knowledge and context, like let's say it was at a retreat center and there's like, let's say 5 facilitators and they're supporting multiple people. Um, of which this is just one of many facilitators supporting. So this person's coming out and they're like, let's say they're in charge of the retreat center and they're making a comment on it while it's happening. Then you're getting closer to the sort of journalistic sort of thing.
Well, but it's also like I think well the angle that I would come at it at from and my initial thoughts on it were even if you have even if the person is consented to it, like the client's consented to it, there is also the this facilitator is supposed to be they are supposed to be holding space for this person. They are supposed to be helping them feel comfortable and safe, but also quite literally helping keep them safe in the actual like physical bodily sense. So my worry would be that there is the potential for their attention to be split, because they're recording. If there is no one else around, if it's literally just them and a client, then then they're not kind of devoting their full attention and energy to holding space for them when they're recording themselves.
Yeah.
And
this is the larger concern.
And this is the larger concern.
Yeah,
This is
even though consent is obviously a concern, no matter what, the bigger concern is like, if they were the only facilitator for this client, and they are taking, and it's worth noting some of the knowledge that Sam and I know about a 12-gram mushroom journey is not, the person is pretty incapacitated.
Yes.
Right? It's on the range of incapacitation that you could have for a mushroom journey. That's on the higher end of incapacitation.
Yes, they're probably not.
Is higher.
Yes, they are probably not able to really move around very much themselves, and if they are, they are almost certainly, they're not going to be capable if they move at all. But they're not going to be capable of really unlikely to be capable of walking around the room, for example, without running into something or falling over.
Right.
For example,
and worth saying, I can add another little fact to this case. Like, they did mention that the person had headphones on and a blindfold that they had like at some point briefly taken off, and then when they were having a panic moment, and then they were encouraged to stay in it, and then they went back in and put the blindfold and listened to the music, as it were, or whatever they were listening to. So, which makes me think, at least in terms of greater context, okay, it looks like they were probably lying down or sitting down, lying down most likely, with the blindfold and with the headset on. So I think strangely, because the person would be more incapacitated, a facilitator might be more tempted to record themselves, because there isn't much happening.
They're not going anywhere. They've got the headphones on. So, and this is my other concern: is like, well, yes, they have the headphones on, so you're mostly sure that they can't hear you. They don't know that they. And that would be a thing. It's like, what if I didn't have the headphones on? It's not necessarily, even if I consented, this might kind of be interrupting my inner process if I suddenly hear my sitter start talking on their phone about how the process is and how the journey is going for me. I'm going to be honest, if that was me, there have been times in my life when that would not be what I wanted to hear. If I was in the middle of a really heavy experience where I was possibly sort of, finding challenging, the person who's sitting for me gets out their phone and is like, oh, Sam's having a tough time. He's just taken his eye mask and his headphones off, but I've asked him to get back in it. Like,
if I was nature commentaries, watches the gazelle.
Watches the gazelle. And it's like, if I was 12 grams deep, I might be okay. I might just think that's hilarious. But if I recall, sometimes when I've been having a challenging time, I think that would really kind of throw me for a bit of a unpleasant loop. So you'd want to be really sure.
It introduces a risk that isn't necessary. That's another thing for me. It's like, that's not a part of the main experience, that it could introduce an additional risk that was not a part of the original journey experience or the intention, right? That that's unnecessary, which I think is another thing worth mentioning. It's like it's not just that someone recorded while they were facilitating, or whether or not they had consent, or whether or not the person was actually in any harm's way, particularly. You are actually adding another risk for harm that is not necessary. And I think in general, we have a responsibility to not introduce potential harms.
Well, not
Um,
without some good reason to do so,
yeah, good reason,
and
justified.
then
Just
and it's like, is the reason proportionally good? Is you being able to
right,
record a video where you show, what a cool facilitator you are? Is that is that sufficient? Is the education you're doing sufficient to justify kind of adding this element in? I mean, like, again, it's, I can imagine, if everyone's kind of, in consent, and everyone's intentions, including, both the client and the facilitator, if those are kind of in alignment, then there's less of a problem. Like, if you go into this knowing that this is what they're going to do, and you know that you're not doing this, your primary way, primary point of view participating in this as the client is to be that person, where the guide talks through their process of sitting for you. Like,
right.
that's one thing, because you are part of providing the education. But if you've gone to them because you're suffering from horrendous crippling depression, like, and you might still consent to this, but your primary intention is to work through, the things that you have going on with you. Your primary intention is not to provide education for people, and like, if that's, so where, like, if, I would find it so strange to be in a position where, if I was at that point where I was going and having this experience for whatever reason, but if my reasons for having the experience weren't to provide, to provide, an educational resource, then, like, it's already kind of weird, because it's not my exact intention. And then, like, that just, again, like, even if I never knew that they were recording, even if I never detected it, even if I never noticed, I'd know that if they got a consent beforehand, I'd know that they were going to do that, and that would be weird, and that would
Well, and also just to counter on
change
the
my
education
experience.
point, right? Because you can't just look at education outside of context. Like there are plenty of videos out there in the world, documentaries included, that already have this form of education, right? Now you could argue maybe they're not as accessible, or you don't want to watch that Netflix documentary or whatever, whatever the thing, or like search for the things on YouTube that already exist, or maybe they're not well held, or or maybe it's just educating how they particularly hold it, and that's unique or something like that. Um, Even if it was for good reasons, and even if they were, is it, what do we think is the real motivation? What's the ultimate result or consequence from this? Even if the intention is virtuous, and consent was gotten, and no harm, no direct harm from, not being as held, perhaps, or possibly, right? And I guess this gets us to our takeaways. So this is the idea. So let's get to our takeaways, or other additional thoughts. So my takeaways are, well, one is just, if there's any recording involved in any part of the experience, uh, you need to address consent, and the bar has to be pretty high.
Yes.
And if there is a higher dose, I think that obligation increases, doesn't decrease, in terms of, how important that consent is, right? Because your capacity is reduced, right? So you need more checks and balances, and informed consent than if you didn't. And I think also that the benefits would need to outweigh the potential risk for harm.
Yeah, that's right. Being aware that the risk can seem subtle, this isn't necessarily a risk, you know, but again, because someone is in such a vulnerable state, the risks are higher, in that they do require, quite a bit of your attention, and you do need to kind of be, present.
Well, and also they've agreed to do that, right? Like
But yeah,
it's not just someone who's like, you're sitting as a friend or at you know, a I mean, okay, not that these things aren't, we shouldn't be safe in these sort of circumstances, right? But um but the fact is there is an agreement between them that this person is holding space for them,
yeah, but
right?
even if it
Yeah.
was just your friends, I mean, it's still like, I mean, I perhaps, unfairly can't get over the feeling that there's something weird about it. Like if even between friends, that would be strange to
Well,
be like, it's like you've come to me and you're upset, and I'm like, oh, Sandra, you're having a terrible time, and you're crying and stuff, and I go, look, just let me get up my phone. Well, Sandra's having a terrible time. What should I talk her through it? I mean, like, what
right, right.
like
I think that's a really good,
you
because
don't think this
doing a
just
case
seems a little bit
comparison,
like
right?
I
Like,
think if
wouldn't
people
you feel violated if your friend did that, like on social media, while you're having a private conversation and you're emotionally vulnerable and crying and having a
and
breakdown, and someone's using it, extracting it for their own personal gain or for
yeah,
marketing or for leveraging for their brand or whatever the thing is, and that's what I think is like the bigger thing. Like, would if you wouldn't do this to a friend, in that circumstance, what would justify you doing it in this
yeah.
circumstance?
Well, you wouldn't do it for a friend, but nor actually if you were a licensed therapist of any kind would you do
Right,
this. Like,
right.
it's just, and not necessarily because of not just because of the extractive nature of it, but again because your job is to attend to this person. You know, that is your job. Your job is not to make videos about it. And I really want to, uh, you know, I can sort of I feel like this is probably, my instinct is this is likely kind of quite self-aggrandizing, but I haven't seen the video and I don't know this person, so I can't say for sure if that was the case, but it's
But even if it's not
yeah,
self-care,
even
like
if it's
even
not,
if,
you
and
know,
I think here's another good point. I'm going to say this about myself now, like even, is that even if they met all of the considerations, right? And I kind of brought it up earlier, right? They've they're educating, they're informing, it's in grounded, like based on like what we're saying at the beginning, has all the benefits. Um, you know, does it actually outweigh, is it beneficial enough to justify that risk, right? Is it good enough? Like even if you only have good consequences or good results, or they facilitated, well, which we can't fully see, right? That it may not be enough to justify doing it, even if there is some benefit, even if there's
yes,
some benefit,
yes,
right?
yes.
um, but anyway, well, any final thoughts as we wrap this up?
Look, my final thoughts, would be fairly blunt. Is if you're a facilitator, don't do this. I think
Yeah, I
it's a
would
bad
not
idea.
recommend. I would not
I
recommend.
do not recommend you do this if you're a client working with facilitator or guides and they ask you to do this. Um, I would say no. I would consider, I'm rather strongly, and this is perhaps controversial, if someone asks you to do this, I would reconsider whether or not I even worked with them. If they aren't,
Right.
just because they asked me that, like, but that's just me. So people can make their own
No, I
decisions.
think
But
that's worth
but
considering.
yeah,
We don't know if it was a first time journey or a repeated journey or either. And that's another concern of mine that we didn't really touch on. But I would agree with you that I would not recommend this as a practice. I can have empathy and compassion for some of the motivations for doing this. But at the end of the day, I think more likely than not, if I was this facilitator and I had this on social media and I had done this, right, I would recommend removing it. And if you hadn't had those conversations with that client, I would recommend having those conversations with them, and to properly inform them and possibly make amends. Because more likely this is probably a rupture situation, than something that was, and it doesn't mean they didn't have good intentions, right? Sometimes we make choices and we think we've done all the right things, and it's okay to make mistakes, but do your best to make it right. So if you have done this in the past, or you've done it, or you've recorded, yourself making a commentary, and I know we can, there's lots of stuff on social media now with, you have these sort of live Twitch commentaries while people are playing a video game. It's totally different situation. When it talks about something where you have a personal responsibility, where someone is in diminished capacity, and we don't want to get complacent and start encouraging people to have this sort of practice also in terms of modeling, especially when we don't know all the information and they haven't made it clear about what consent was done and what considerations were done, and and it could encourage other facilitators to do something similar. And even if this didn't end up in a negative outcome, something else would.
Yeah,
Anyway.
basically, yes.
Okay, thanks for listening. Hope you enjoyed this little case study of the recording facilitator. If you have ideas or recordings, or I mean, not recordings necessarily. I mean, like, I guess if it's social media, you can share it with us, like this person did. But other case studies you want to share, anonymized, ideally, public knowledge. Um, but we're open to your cases, and we want to encourage conversations about these sort of issues. And thanks to the facilitator who gave us this case to examine, and look forward to talking to you all next time.